He came to her village without a name, a broken man fleeing a past he couldn't outrun. She was a woman who lived by her own rules, hiding in the shadows of a quiet valley. When she offered him shelter from the storm, she never imagined that a single act of kindness would tear down the walls around his heart, or that the man she was nursing back to health would eventually force her to choose between the life she knew and a future she never dared to dream of. But before he could find redemption, the truth he had hidden would threaten to destroy everything. The sky over the small village of Vale Verde had turned into a heavy shroud of lead, unleashing a storm that transformed the dirt paths into treacherous traps of mud. It was at the peak of this atmospheric chaos that a lone rider, wrapped in a dark, drenched cloak, appeared on the main road, mounted on a horse that exhaled the exhaustion of a long journey. He carried no crests nor companions, only the silence of someone seeking absolute anonymity while the wind lashed against his face. The figure stopped before the village's only inn, a place where the candlelight barely managed to overcome the darkness of that cruel night. The man dismounted with an elegance that contrasted sharply with his simple attire, worn down by the dust of the road. Every movement of his, though restrained, betrayed an aristocratic posture that he attempted, in vain, to hide beneath the austerity of a common traveler. The few villagers still out and about observed the scene with caution, sensing that the village's routine peace would be irrevocably altered by that presence. He did not look back, nor did he seek recognition, simply pushing open the heavy door of the inn, bringing with him the freezing air and the mystery of someone who possessed secrets too heavy to be carried in the light of day. If you are moved by stories of honor, redemption, and hidden love, please subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more cinematic historical dramas to life every week. Upon crossing the threshold of the inn, the stranger was met with the inquisitive gaze of the innkeeper, who promptly demanded the guest's registration. The man, maintaining a low and firm tone of voice, requested only a room in the back, far from the windows facing the central square, without offering any identity. He paid in advance with gold coins that seemed to belong to an era more prosperous than the one the village was experiencing. The refusal to speak his own name immediately became the most discussed topic among the regular customers of that establishment. In a community where everyone knew one another's lineage down to the third generation, a man without a name was seen as a blank page that everyone wished to fill with speculation. He ignored every attempt at approach, remaining reclusive and avoiding any eye contact that could lead to a prolonged conversation. Inside that modest room, he watched the shadows dance on the walls, struggling against the memories of a world of privilege that he had abandoned with a fierce determination. For him, that village was not a destination, but a hiding place. A necessary purgatory where the lack of a name was his only protection against the suffocating expectations of his former life. Vale Verde was a refuge hidden between hills, a place where the seasons dictated the rhythm of life and news from the outside world arrived, at best, months late. The village's geographic isolation created an atmosphere of stagnation that, for most, was a source of comfort. But for the stranger who had settled in the inn, it was the perfect setting for invisibility. He walked the rural trails in the early morning hours, before the village awoke, avoiding the curious gazes of the peasants who were not yet sure if he was a threat or just an eccentric. Isolation, however, was a double-edged sword. While the village protected his anonymity, it also forced him to confront his own loneliness without the distraction of social conventions. He spent hours by the creek that cut through the valley, watching the current, trying to find in the clear waters the clarity of thought that his life in the capital had denied him. Each day of silence was a victory over the pressures that, before, had dictated his steps and shaped his destiny. However, the strangeness of his routine began to generate an aura of mystery that fascinated and, at the same time, kept the villagers at a distance. He did not seek work, did not frequent the tavern at night, and possessed a posture that, despite being disheveled, never lost its dignity. To Vale Verde, he was an unsolvable enigma that little by little was becoming the central element in the monotony of their lives. The protagonist of this story, a woman named Helena, lived in a modest stone house on the outskirts of the village, where she dedicated her days to cultivating medicinal herbs. She was known for her discretion and her almost magical ability to soothe pains that the local doctor did not understand. It was on an autumn afternoon, while gathering wildflowers near the forest, that Helena found the stranger fallen near the creek, victim of a sudden fever caused by the harsh winter that was approaching. Without hesitation, and ignoring the rumors circulating in the village about the man without a name, she helped him stand, using her surprising strength to take him to the porch of her house. She did not question him about who he was or what he was doing there, focusing only on the urgency of lowering his temperature and offering some comfort amidst the weakness that overcame him. The gesture was purely human, born of a sense of duty that Helena had carried since she learned the craft of healing. That was the moment when the man's barrier of isolation began to yield, for he had never been under the care of someone who expected nothing in return but his recovery. While she administered infusions and covered his trembling body with blankets, the man felt for the first time in months the peace of an environment where his title or status did not matter, but where his survival was the only priority. As Helena cared for the stranger in her house, the gossip in the outskirts of Vale Verde grew with overwhelming speed, fueled by distrust and fear of the unknown. The more conservative residents saw Helena's attitude as dangerous recklessness, believing she was attracting a curse or someone fleeing justice into their safe borders. They gathered in whispering groups in the square, speculating about the true intentions of that man who seemed to hide emotional and physical scars. Some suggested that the innkeeper should expel him, fearing that his presence would bring unwanted eyes from the royal guard or authorities who had never before had reasons to visit that forgotten village. The tension was palpable, and paranoia turned simple facts into imminent threats, painting the outsider as a potential villain who had corrupted the peace of the region's most respected healer. Helena, however, maintained her serene posture, refusing to feed the rumors and focusing entirely on the patient who, slowly, regained his strength under the roof of her house. She knew that kindness, in a small community, was often confused with naivety, but she was willing to face the judgment of others to save a life. The clash between the young woman's compassion and the villager's cynicism was just beginning, and the stranger was at the center of a social storm that he himself, unknowingly, had triggered. But the village's growing hostility was the least of their worries. Something much darker was approaching the valley, a force that would not only expose who he was, but put everything Helena loved at risk. Helena began to notice small, unsettling changes in her own heart, realizing that her life had been defined by a quiet, solitary routine until his arrival. She found herself preparing meals with more care, lingering in the parlor longer than necessary, and feeling a sharp sense of loss whenever he retreated to his room. The presence of the man had cracked the foundation of her independence, making her yearn for a companionship she had long ago convinced herself she did not need. The villagers' increasing hostility began to weigh heavily on her, but the prospect of his departure now caused her more pain than the fear of social isolation. She struggled to reconcile the independent woman she had been with, the person who now felt incomplete when the house was quiet. Every glance they exchanged in the fading light of the hearth became a silent acknowledgement of the shift occurring between them. A fragile bridge built on unspoken emotions. She started to question whether she was protecting a guest or anchoring a ghost. a man who belonged to a world she could barely imagine. The realization that she might be falling for a stranger whose name she still did not know terrified her. Yet she could not bring herself to push him away. The rupture in her former life was complete, and she found herself standing on the precipice of a choice that would redefine her future. The man watched Helena from the shadows of the doorway, observing the subtle shifts in her demeanor and the way her confidence seemed to flicker when their eyes met. He realized that his presence was not merely a physical burden on her, but an emotional one, as she had opened her life to someone who remained a mystery. He felt a profound sense of emptiness knowing that, despite the intimacy of their shared days, he was fundamentally a hollow man until he chose to reveal his true self. The silence of the house, which he had once cherished, now felt heavy with the weight of the secrets he kept guarded. He saw the way she looked at him, with a mixture of curiosity, kindness, and a dawning, fearful hope, and it tore at the remnants of his resolve. He understood that by staying, he was drawing her into the complexities of his own fractured existence, a reality that threatened to consume the peace she had built for herself. For the first time, he recognized that his flight from the capital was not just an escape from expectations, but a retreat from the vulnerability required to truly connect with another person. The emptiness he felt was no longer just the product of social alienation, but the result of withholding the truth from the woman who had saved him. He saw the void he was creating by staying silent, and it began to dawn on him that his true liberation lay not in hiding, but in being known. The man's true nature began to surface in small, involuntary gestures that defied his attempt at simplicity. One evening, he effortlessly corrected an error in a ledger Helena used for her herb sales, his handwriting flowing in a disciplined, elegant script that was worlds apart from the local style. When Helena pointed it out, he quickly brushed it off as a skill learned from a former tutor, his eyes flickering with a momentary, guarded sharpness that she did not miss. He handled the simple tools of her trade with a subconscious grace, occasionally revealing an intimate knowledge of materials or logistics that a mere wanderer should not possess. It wasn't just his demeanor. It was the way he commanded the space around him, a silent, authoritative energy that seemed to command respect even in the midst of his humble circumstances. Helena began to piece together a picture of a man who was clearly accustomed to influence and decision-making, far beyond the reach of their sleepy village. Her realization didn't lead to fear, but to a deeper, more profound fascination with the man he was trying to bury. She began to see that his reticence wasn't just about protecting his identity, but about grieving the loss of the life he felt he had to renounce. The gap between the stranger and the man of stature became impossible to ignore, leaving Helena to wonder what kind of weight he had been carrying when he stumbled into her life. Under the silver light of the moon, they sat in the small garden, the scent of lavender and damp earth surrounding them. It was there, amidst the stillness of the night, that he finally began to speak of his past, not as a list of facts, but as a map of the heart. He spoke of the suffocating nature of expectations and the cold, unyielding structures of the aristocratic circles he had called home. His words were raw and unadorned, reflecting a soul that had been starved for genuine expression. Helena sat beside him, listening with a patience that anchored him as he waded through the murky waters of his memories. She didn't offer platitudes or demand justifications. She simply provided the space for him to exist as he was. In that conversation, he revealed that his flight was not an act of cowardice, but an attempt to find a version of himself that didn't need to be measured against a family legacy or a social title. The vulnerability he shared transformed the garden into a sanctuary, the air charged with the gravity of his confession. Helena realized then that she was the first person in his life to whom he had spoken without a filter or an agenda. The walls that he had constructed were crumbling, and in their place, a tentative, fragile trust was blossoming, one that felt more honest than anything he had experienced in the halls of power. As the night deepened, the man let slip the truth of the world he had left behind. A tale of betrayal within his own house, and the realization that his worth had always been conditional on his adherence to his family's demands. He described the capital not as a city of lights and wonders, but as a gilded cage where every action was a performance. His voice trembled with a quiet, lingering rage as he recounted how he had been groomed for a role that required the sacrifice of his own integrity. Helena could feel the coldness of the world he described, a sharp contrast to the warmth of her own, and it made his choice to hide in Vale Verde even more poignant. He hadn't just left a city. He had left a role he could no longer play, choosing the poverty of anonymity over the richness of a lie. The tragedy in his story wasn't the loss of his position, but the realization that it had cost him his ability to trust the people closest to him. The revelation left a heavy silence between them, the weight of his history casting long shadows over the garden. Helena looked at him and saw not the stranger who had arrived on a stormy night, but a man who had fought to reclaim his own voice. The painful truth of his past, once a secret he guarded with his life, was now out in the open. And for both of them, there was no going back to the way things were before. If you are moved by stories of honor, redemption, and hidden love, please subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more cinematic historical dramas to life every week. He spent his days performing tasks that would have been alien to his former self, yet his hands told a different story. Even when he labored over the woodpile or helped Helena organize her stores, his movements retained a precision and lack of calluses that stood in stark contrast to the rough, weathered hands of the village laborers. He often wore heavy gloves, even indoors, a habit he claimed was for protection against the biting cold. But Helena noticed the way he would instinctively keep them hidden when the villagers drew too near. It was a delicate dance of deception. He had to prove he was a man of the earth while being constantly betrayed by the very grace he had spent a lifetime cultivating. Helena watched him struggle with these small, revealing details, her heart aching for the effort it took for him to perform this daily theater. She realized that he was not just hiding his name, but the very essence of a lifestyle that had become a prison he was desperate to forget. These moments of near discovery created a hidden tension in their home, a shared secret that deepened the intimacy between them. He became increasingly paranoid about being recognized, his ease in the village beginning to fray as he realized he could never truly shed the skin he had worn since birth. Helena, in turn, became his silent guardian, shielding him from the curious eyes of the village, not knowing that her protection was binding their fates together in ways she could not yet comprehend. He began to find ways to repay her, not with currency, which he knew she would refuse, but with the quiet, thoughtful gestures of a man who had finally learned the value of a single, genuine act of care. He spent hours meticulously repairing the leaking roof of her cottage, his work far more solid and refined than anything the village carpenter had done in years. He also took to arranging the wildflowers she brought in, his touch gentle and reverent, as if he were honoring the very nature that had nurtured them both. Helena was stunned by these displays, for in his world such tasks were performed by servants, and to see him engage with them was a testament to his transformation. He struggled to find the words to thank her for the life she had given him, his pride often getting in the way of the simple phrase, "I am grateful." Instead, he let his actions speak for him, his devotion manifesting in the way he kept the hearth burning and the way he listened to her, truly listened to the stories of her day. These expressions of gratitude were the most intimate moments they shared, far more powerful than any spoken declaration of love. He was learning a new language, one of service and presence, and she was learning that the man who had arrived without a name was a person of profound depth and capacity. The house, once a place of labor, had become a theater of devotion where they both, for the first time, felt the quiet, steady hum of belonging. He was learning how to be a man, but the past he tried to bury was already hunting him. What happened next would prove that some secrets are too powerful to stay hidden, no matter how far you run. The burden of his past remained a looming shadow, the secret of his life in the capital eating away at the fragile peace he had built in Vale Verde. He would often wake in the middle of the night, haunted by the suffocating pressures of his family's expectations and the cold, calculated betrayals he had witnessed among his peers. He had been a high-ranking aristocrat, a man whose word could sway fortunes, yet here he was nobody, a realization that brought him both immense relief and a crushing sense of loss. He carried the weight of a legacy he had rejected, a story of power, intrigue, and the ultimate cold loneliness of those who have everything yet possess nothing. He could not bring himself to tell Helena the full extent of his history, fearing that the revelation of his status would shatter the sanctuary she had created for him. He was trapped between the man he had been, defined by blood and duty, and the man he was becoming, defined by the simple choices of a life lived in the light of day. This duality was his greatest trial, a storm of conflicted loyalties that threatened to consume him from within. He realized that as long as he kept his secret, he was still living in the shadow of the capital, not truly free to embrace the life he was building. The secret was a wall that kept him from being entirely hers, a final, unbreakable barrier that defined the limits of his freedom and his ability to be whole. The more he lived in the quiet, honest rhythm of the village, the more he despised the hollow, performative existence of the circle he had left behind. He recounted for Helena the endless, vapid social games, the strategic marriages, and the heartless competition that defined the lives of the aristocrats he had known. His bitterness was not born of envy, but of a deep, sorrowful realization that he had spent years of his life playing a part in a play that had no heart and no soul. He described the people he had once called his peers as masks worn by individuals who had forgotten how to look at the world without calculating its value. He had been a player in that game, and his greatest regret was the time he had lost being someone he was not. Now, seeing the world through Helena's eyes, full of genuine beauty, hardship, and unvarnished truth, he understood the true cost of the status he had once guarded. The depth of his disappointment was a bridge to a new understanding, a rejection of the superficial that bound him even closer to the woman who was its antithesis. He didn't just love her. He loved the reality she represented, a life free from the suffocating weight of pretense. His past was not just a memory, but a cautionary tale, one that he was determined never to return to, regardless of the consequences his departure might have caused. If you are moved by stories of honor, redemption, and hidden love, please subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more cinematic historical dramas to life every week. Helena had become his mirror, a reflection of the humanity he had spent years suppressing in the halls of power. In her simple joy at the changing seasons, her resilience in the face of hardship, and her unfiltered honesty, he saw the person he had been before the world tried to mold him into a cold, efficient instrument of duty. She was the light that forced him to see himself clearly, stripped of his titles and the armor he had worn for so long. She did not demand he be more than he was. Yet her very existence challenged him to live up to the promise he had made to himself when he arrived in Vale Verde. She became the standard against which he measured his soul, forcing him to confront the dark corners of his history that he was still hiding from. In her presence, the lies he had told himself lost their power, leaving him naked before the truth of his own desires. He realized that she was not just a woman who had saved him. She was the catalyst for a fundamental change that he could no longer resist. She was his mirror because she loved him for who he was in her kitchen, not for what he could offer a court or a crown. This realization was both terrifying and liberating, for it meant that his past, the nameless life he was leading, was finally beginning to give way to a future defined by choice. The serenity of the cottage was increasingly haunted by the specter of his former responsibilities. He would often find himself standing at the edge of the woods, torn between the simple, honest life he had cultivated with Helena and the crushing weight of the duties he had abandoned in the capital. The man knew that his disappearance had left a void in his family's influence, and that his absence was being felt in the corridors of power, creating a vacuum that others were surely rushing to fill. He agonized over the morality of his choice. By fleeing, he had achieved his own freedom. But had he also betrayed the very principles of duty and honor he had been raised to uphold? This internal battle raged daily, a silent storm that made him appear distant and moody, even as Helena tried to comfort him. He felt like a traitor to his bloodline. Yet the thought of returning to that life felt like a slow death of his own soul. Helena could see the turmoil in his eyes, the way he would tighten his grip on a wooden tool until his knuckles turned white, as if he were holding on to the only reality he could trust. She did not know the specifics of his burden, but she understood the language of sacrifice better than anyone. They were two people living in a suspended state, waiting for the past to finally collide with their fragile, secret present. He stood at a crossroads. Return to the life he despised, or stay and watch Helena suffer for his presence. The decision he made in the dead of night would shock the entire village. Rumors of a missing nobleman began to reach even the remote corners of the kingdom, carried by traveling merchants who whispered of a grand search being conducted by the elite. The man, hearing these echoes from a world he had rejected, realized that his time in Vale Verde was rapidly running out. The anonymity he had cherished was being chipped away by the reach of his own reputation, and he felt the walls closing in as the whispers became more frequent in the village market. Every stranger who entered the village was a potential threat, and every unexpected arrival made his pulse quicken with dread. He lived in a state of hyper-vigilance, his every move calculated to avoid detection, which only made him seem more suspicious to the villagers. The past was no longer a ghost he could ignore. It was a physical force, tracking him down through the vast network of influence he had once commanded. And it was getting closer with every passing day. Helena noticed his heightened state of alarm, the way he would pause at every unfamiliar footstep, and the haunted look that never fully left his face. She realized that the nameless stranger was a man of importance, someone whose absence was being treated as a crisis by those in high places. The protective bubble she had placed around him was bursting, and she felt a chilling certainty that the peace of her life was about to be shattered by the arrival of his former life. The crisis arrived on a crisp afternoon, when the peace of the village was shattered not by a stroke of bad luck, but by the rhythmic, calculated sound of the ducal guard's horses. They were not passing through by accident. They had followed the trail of gold and local rumors for weeks, closing in on the fugitive's position. The trap had finally snapped shut, and the fate he had spent months running from had arrived to claim him. As they moved through the square, the man, who was helping Helena clear a path, came face to face with a commander who had once served in his own personal guard. For a frozen second, the world seemed to stop, the recognition flashing across the commander's face like lightning. The man's heart hammered against his ribs as he instinctively pulled his cloak tighter, his mind racing to find a way to maintain the ruse. He stood perfectly still, his eyes locked with the commander's, a silent war of wills occurring in the middle of the crowded square. It was only the sudden, boisterous interruption of a local farmer that broke the trance, allowing the man to slip away into the shadows of the nearby alley, his breathing ragged and his hands shaking. The near exposure left him devastated, the reality of his situation hitting him with the force of a physical blow. He had been a breath away from being dragged back to the life he had fought to escape, and the terror of that moment was etched into his soul. Helena had witnessed the entire scene from afar, and as they later sat in the kitchen, the unspoken realization hung between them. He could no longer hide. For weeks, the village leader watched the stranger work, whispering to others. He fixes her roof like a master artisan, yet his hands have never touched a day of honest, hard labor. Helena is being fooled by a man who has no roots in our soil. This envy ensured that when his identity was finally revealed, the village did not just feel shock. They felt a sense of vindication in their previous hatred, turning against Helena for being an accomplice to his deception. They openly accused her of harboring a criminal, their voices loud and demanding as they gathered outside her gate. The village leader, the same man who had long cast shadows of doubt upon the stranger, orchestrated the confrontation. Hoping to deliver the Duke to the royal delegation in exchange for a handsome reward, he stood in direct, villainous opposition to Helena's protection, giving the village's greed a cruel and calculated face. Helena stood before them, a small, resolute figure, her back straight, and her gaze unyielding. She did not defend him with a list of facts or explanations, for she had none to give. Instead, she defended him with her own character, pointing to the months of quiet, honest work he had performed under her roof. Her defense was a masterclass in quiet authority, and she made it clear that her home was not open to the intrusive judgments of those who had never walked in his shoes. The man, listening from the shadows of the cottage, was overwhelmed by the courage of this woman who was risking her own reputation to safeguard his secret. He had never had anyone stand up for him. Not his family, not his peers, and certainly not the people he had commanded. And the realization of her sacrifice moved him in a way that left him speechless. In that moment he saw that his true honor was not found in his lineage, but in the woman who was willing to lose everything for his sake. The pressure of the villagers' inquiries, coupled with the arrival of the guards, finally forced the truth to the surface. One evening, as they were cleaning the kitchen, the commander from the passing delegation returned, having sought out the cottage under the cover of night. He had recognized the man's horse, a beast with the unique markings of the ducal stables, and he bowed low before the stranger, addressing him by a title that sounded alien in the rustic setting of the cottage. The name, spoken aloud, hit the air like a thunderclap, stripping away the thin veneer of the stranger and revealing the Duke of Valerius, a man whose influence and family name had shaped the history of the realm. Helena stood paralyzed in the corner of the room, her hand clutching the edge of the table as the weight of the revelation settled over them. The man she had saved, the man she had loved in the quiet simplicity of her home, was the very architect of the world she had only ever heard of in tales. He did not look at the commander. He looked only at Helena, his expression a desperate, heartbreaking plea for understanding. He had not lied because he wanted to deceive her, but because he was terrified that the truth would create an insurmountable wall between them. The cottage, once a refuge for two equals, was suddenly the stage for a revelation that threatened to break the very heart of the connection they had built. The silence that followed the commander's revelation was suffocating. heavy with the weight of shattered illusions. The man, now fully unmasked as the Duke of Valerius, stood frozen, his eyes desperately seeking Helena's, but finding only a stunned, painful confusion. He felt a visceral agony, realizing that the very protection he had sought by hiding his identity had, in the end, created the foundation for a much deeper betrayal. He wanted to reach out, to bridge the distance that had suddenly become an uncrossable chasm, but his aristocratic training paralyzed him. He feared that any explanation would sound like a polished lie, a masterfully crafted defense intended to manipulate her rather than appease her hurt. The dread of losing her, not just as a companion, but as the only person who had ever truly seen the man behind the title, was a fear far more intense than any threat to his rank or safety. Helena's expression was unreadable, a mixture of shock and a quiet, inward collapse that hurt him more than any public condemnation could. He watched as the warmth she had once directed toward him was replaced by a guarded, analytical distance. He had been so focused on protecting himself from the world outside that he hadn't realized he was building a ticking bomb inside the only home that had ever offered him peace. The presence of the commander and the sudden awareness of who the stranger really was began to seep into the village like poison. A local celebration, meant to be a quiet gathering, became the stage for a forced confrontation. As the Duke attempted to maintain his quiet retreat, he was approached by various villagers who, now armed with the knowledge of his status, shifted from wary curiosity to sycophantic reverence. They crowded around him, their voices thick with insincere flattery and greedy requests, treating him as a miracle to be harvested. The Duke found himself trapped in the very nightmare he had fled, being defined solely by his position rather than his actions. He stood in the center of the square, surrounded by people who were no longer neighbors but subjects, their eyes looking for favor rather than fellowship. He could see Helena watching from the edges of the crowd, her face pale, and he felt a burning hatred for the title that was systematically stripping away the last remnants of his dignity. He tried to deflect the unwanted attention, but the more he denied his importance, the more the villagers were convinced of his nobility. The event turned into a grotesque mockery of his desire for simplicity, with the commander's delegation looming in the background, a constant reminder of the life he had sought to abandon. Every interaction felt like a betrayal of the life he had shared with Helena, and he felt the walls of his exile finally collapsing under the weight of his own name. The mask had finally fallen, and the villagers were paralyzed with terror. But the true heartbreak wasn't his status. It was the look in Helena's eyes when she realized who he really was. Word spread like wildfire throughout the valley. The man who had worked their fields and shared their bread was one of the most powerful peers of the realm. The disbelief was universal, turning into a frantic, chaotic energy that infected every household in Vale Verde. People who had once ignored him now stood in his path, desperate for a glimpse, a word, or a favor, turning the village square into a surreal circus of misplaced ambition. The village elders, who had once been his loudest accusers, now found themselves bowing in his presence, their previous hostility transformed into a nervous, groveling subservience. It was a pathetic display that revolted the Duke, reinforcing every cynical lesson he had learned about human nature in the capital. He saw how easily their principles were discarded in the face of proximity to power, and he felt a profound, aching loneliness for the genuine connections he had thought he was forging. Helena remained the only anchor in the madness, watching as her community proved to be just as shallow as the world the Duke had escaped. She saw the change in their eyes, a dull, greedy hunger, and it solidified the painful divide between the man he was and the man they now worshipped. The shock of the revelation didn't just change their opinion of him, It destroyed the possibility of him ever being a normal member of their world again. The commander, frustrated by the Duke's continued refusal to acknowledge his duty, laid out the gravity of the situation in front of the village, effectively stripping the man of his remaining mystery. He revealed that the Duke's family had been in a state of chaos since his departure, with rival factions vying for control over the Valerius estates and the political stability of the region hanging in the balance. It was no longer a personal choice, it was a matter of state, and the villagers listened with bated breath, realizing the man in their midst was far more than a mere eccentric. For the Duke, hearing his life described as a series of political maneuvers was a painful stripping away of his humanity. He had viewed his departure as a private act of liberation, but the commander's account reframed it as an act of negligence that had jeopardized the lives of thousands. The revelation was not just about who he was, but about the wreckage he had left in his wake, a reality he could no longer hide behind the excuse of his own happiness. Helena stood in the crowd, absorbing the magnitude of the responsibilities that had been placed on his shoulders. She had thought he was a man running from a bad marriage or a broken heart, but the truth was far more complex and dangerous. She realized that the barrier between them wasn't just his deception, but the insurmountable weight of his position, a wall built of duty, history, and power that she had no hope of overcoming. Back in the solitude of the cottage, the silence was absolute. Helena turned to him, her eyes reflecting the hurt of a woman who had poured her heart into a foundation of sand. She didn't scream or demand answers. She simply asked him why he hadn't trusted her, why he had allowed her to believe they were equals when a kingdom stood between them. Her voice was steady, but it carried the quiet, devastating sound of a trust that had been irreparably broken. He tried to explain, his words spilling out in a rush of regret and desperate justification, but he knew they fell short. He had let her defend him against the village, let her fight for a man who didn't exist, and that was the core of her pain. She felt used, not by his actions, but by the omission of the truth that had turned their connection into a lie. To Helena, the Duke of Valerius was not a title. He was a stranger who had walked into her home and stolen a vulnerability she had never shared with anyone else. The realization that her love had been built on a foundation of calculated silence shattered the serenity of their time together. She had offered him her home, her care, and her deepest self, only to find that he had kept his real world locked away behind a door she was never allowed to touch. The betrayal wasn't about his status. It was about the lack of faith in the one person who had been the only one to truly care for him. Com certeza. Chegamos ao desfecho. Vou garantir que este último bloco encerre a jornada de forma emocionante, mantendo o tom elegante e detalhista que a história pede. The days that followed the revelation were marked by a suffocating silence that filled every corner of the cottage. Helena retreated into her work, her movements mechanical and distant, as if she were trying to rebuild the walls around her heart that he had so effortlessly dismantled. The Duke, unable to bear the weight of her disappointment, spent hours wandering the desolate hills, his mind a fractured landscape of regret and the painful realization that he had lost the only place where he truly felt human. They lived like strangers under the same roof, their lives once intertwined now frayed by the unspoken hurt that stood between them. Every meal was an exercise in restraint, every glance a carefully navigated path of caution and memory. The distance was not merely physical, it was an emotional canyon created by the weight of his identity, a distance he desperately wanted to bridge, but lacked the courage to cross, while his own heart remained in such turmoil. He realized that his departure was no longer just a possibility, it was a necessity, not to escape his responsibilities, but to give Helena the space to heal from the deception he had inflicted upon her. He watched her from afar, seeing the way her light seemed to dim in his presence, and the guilt became a constant, aching companion. He had come to the village to hide, but in finding Helena, he had discovered the one person who could truly see him, and he was now the instrument of her sorrow. The day of his departure arrived with a cold, biting wind that echoed the finality of his decision. He stood at the cottage gate, his horse saddled and ready, his belongings packed, a meager collection of memories that paled in comparison to what he was leaving behind. He looked at the modest stone house, the garden where they had shared their deepest truths, and finally at Helena, who stood on the threshold, her expression a fragile mask of composure. He did not offer a grand farewell or a promise of easy return. He simply thanked her for a life he had not deserved, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer contain. As he rode away, his eyes remained fixed on the horizon, but his spirit was tethered to the quiet, dusty path of Vale Verde. He returned to the capital, not as the man he was when he left, but as one who had been irrevocably changed by the simplicity of a woman who had taught him the meaning of integrity. His journey to the capital was a blur of gray skies and mounting dread, his mind replaying every moment they had spent together. He moved through the opulence of his estate, like a man walking through a museum of a life he no longer owned, his heart remaining in the quiet village he had forsaken. He had reclaimed his title, but he felt an agonizing hollowness, knowing that he had traded the only thing that truly mattered for the duty he had spent a lifetime resenting. Back in the capital, the Duke moved through the corridors of power with a newfound, searing clarity. He listened to the whispers of his peers and the demands of his family, seeing them for what they were, empty vessels of status and greed. He spent his nights in his library, surrounded by the cold, leather-bound books of his lineage, writing a confession that would dismantle the very structures he had been groomed to protect, all in the hope of finding a path back to the woman he had betrayed. He realized that his redemption would not come from fulfilling his duties, but from being honest about the life he had chosen to reject. He did not simply walk away from a title. He was officially disinherited by his bloodline, stripped of his vast estates by the crown, and left with nothing of his former status. He returned to Vale Verde not as a wealthy noble on a retreat, but as a man who had intentionally traded every ounce of his fortune to prove that the only life worth living was the one Helena had offered him. It was a terrifying, exhilarating act of rebellion, one that cost him his standing in the high court, but gave him, for the first time, the right to call himself a man of honor. His decision was not met with favor, but he moved with a resolve that silenced the opposition of his family. He wasn't just a duke anymore. He was a man who had felt the warmth of a hearth in a nameless village, and he knew that no crown, no estate, and no title could ever replace that. The cost of his freedom was everything he had been born with, but the reward was the possibility of a future where he could stand before Helena as a man who had finally shed his masks. He returned to Vale Verde in the early spring, when the fields were just beginning to wake from the winter slumber. He arrived on foot, a deliberate choice to show he was no longer the man of privilege he had been, but someone willing to walk the path he had once taken in his flight. He approached the cottage with a heart hammering in his chest, the weight of his apology carried not in his words, but in the vulnerability of his return. Helena was in the garden, her back turned to him, and for a moment he simply watched her, overwhelmed by the sight of the woman who had redefined his entire existence. When she finally turned, the surprise in her eyes was quickly overtaken by a complex, guarded hurt that he knew he had to navigate with absolute patience. He didn't speak of titles or kingdoms. He spoke only of his regret, of the life he had sacrificed, and of the realization that he was nothing without the truth. He knelt in the soft, damp earth before her, an act that stripped away the last vestiges of his nobility, and asked not for a promise, but for a chance to earn back the trust he had so callously discarded. It was a humble, desperate moment of reckoning, where the Duke of Valerius died, and the man who loved Helena was all that remained. She watched him, seeing the genuine remorse that etched his features, and slowly, the wall between them began to show its first crack. The final act of their story was not a grand wedding in a palace, but a quiet, solemn promise made under the budding trees of the garden they had come to call their own. They chose a life that was far removed from the glare of social expectation, a partnership built on the understanding that love was not a duty to be fulfilled, but a gift to be cherished. He had left behind his past to build a future that belonged entirely to them, and she, in turn, had chosen to forgive the stranger who had finally become her equal. Their life together in Vale Verde was defined by the simplicity they had once sought, a testament to the fact that their connection was never about the names they carried, but about the hearts they had shared. They proved that the most powerful thing one could possess was the honesty to be oneself. And in that honesty, they found a wealth that no title could ever grant. The man who came to her village without a name had found his true identity, not in the eyes of the world, but in the heart of the woman who had seen him for exactly who he was. The story of the Duke and the curandera became a legend in the valley, a tale whispered in the evenings about the man who gave up a kingdom for a life of truth. It was a moral for all who would listen, that love, when stripped of the masks of duty and status, is the only true royalty that survives. And as the sun set over their garden, casting a golden light on their peaceful, chosen existence, they knew that their greatest triumph was not in what they had achieved, but in what they had finally allowed themselves to be. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe and leave a comment below. What would you do if the person you loved was hiding the biggest secret of their life? We read every comment, and we look forward to seeing you in our next historical journey.